It's the Metro on WDET-FM. I'm Tia Graham. Rube Foster was a pioneer in American baseball. His efforts in the early 20th century to organize black baseball teams sparked professional Negro Leagues. The league's style of play, the players, and the business model will go on to arguably alter the course of the U.S. history. Bob Kendrick is the president of the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum in Kansas City, Missouri. In this conversation with the Metro's Kerry Jr. II, he unpacked how Foster's grit and business-savvy tactics turned a fractured era in baseball into a lasting pillar of America's national pastime.
It was not a new phenomena for black folks to play baseball. Mm-hmm. We've been playing baseball for a long time. And there is even evidence of us having played baseball even as enslaved people. So the game is not new to our community. Teams started to form early on. We started going back to the late 1800s as these teams were starting to form, and you had these independent black baseball teams that were starting to organize professionally. And eventually you get to the establishment of a Negro Leagues, in this case, the Negro National League, that was established on February 13th, 1920. So Rube Foster's challenge, and he organized the Negro Leagues here in a meeting held in Kansas City's Paseo YMCA. That historic landmark still stands. But it was in that building that Rube Foster convinced 7 other independent black baseball team owners to give up their independency.
How did he do that?
Basically, the message was that in order for black baseball to not only survive, but thrive, it needed to be organized.
Were they not organized? How were they operating before?
Yeah, see that when you're playing independently, it was okay, I'll get a game here, I'll get a game there. It was so haphazard. Players were jumping from team to team. Booking agents were taking all the money. And so he was able to convince them to say, look, there's a better way to go about this. So let us all come together and create our own league with guidelines and structure for how, these teams would operate.
Rube Foster wasn't the first to come up with the idea of a league, though. Like, other people have tried and they failed. Why was Rube so successful?
Well, Rube Foster, in my own opinion, is the most brilliant baseball mind this sport has ever seen. And no one knows who the heck he is, even though he is rightfully enshrined in the National Baseball Hall of Fame. He was light years ahead of his time. Yeah, Rube Foster is the rarest of baseball figures who would have gone in the Hall of Fame as a player, as a manager, and as an executive. And I can tell you right now, you don't find many, if any, that check all 3 boxes. He had been a great pitcher himself in the early era of black baseball prior to the actual formation of the Negro Leagues. As a matter of fact, he is credited with having invented what we now know to be the screwball. Back then, it was called a fadeaway, and Rube perfected that pitch. So much so that the great Major League manager, John McGraw, would sneak Rube into his camp so that Rube Foster could teach Christy Matheson how to throw the screwball. Now, Christy Matheson threw the pitch all the way into the National Baseball Hall of Fame that he learned from Rube Foster, but Foster was never given credit for it. But Foster was best known as this visionary, this tremendous leader. He would organize the Negro Leagues here in that meeting held at Kansas City's Paseo YMCA. He would become president of his newly formed Negro National League. He owned the Chicago American Giants, and he managed the Chicago American Giants. And as a manager, he was so tremendously savvy to the point that he was known to fine his ball players. Now, this was at the turn of the 1900s, as much as $5 if you were tagged out standing up, oh no, you were supposed to slide. Yeah,
Oh.
Rube would draw a circle down the first base line. He would draw a circle down the third base line. And if every one of his players couldn't drop a bunt inside that circle, man, he would find them. You see, he was adamant about the style of play that would become signature in Negro Leagues baseball. Fast, aggressive, daring. They would bunt their way on. Now they're going to steal second. They're going to steal third. And if you're not too smart, they were stealing home. And so it was a different brand of baseball than what you were seeing in the major leagues. The major leagues were essentially a base-to-base kind of game. So a guy got on base, then they would move him over to second, and then the big hitters would come in and drive him in. Nothing wrong with that. But the pace of the game in the Negro Leagues was fast and aggressive and exciting. As my dear friend, the founder of this museum, the late, great Buck O'Neill would say, you couldn't go to the concession stands because you might miss something you ain't never seen before. Yeah, and so people were excited about this brand of baseball, and that's what Rube brought to the table. And he had the wherewithal to create a successful league because he was just so brilliant. He was a brilliant tactician. He was a brilliant strategist, and he knew the business of this game.
So the aggressive style the Negro League was known for can be in part attributed to the way Foster managed his team.
Yeah, and it was entertaining. It was entertaining. And I think Rube understood that, and the Negro Leagues in general understood that baseball is entertainment. Yeah, and that doesn't mean that you weren't going to see great fundamentally sound baseball. But see, when you add tremendous athleticism to great fundamentals, man, you going to get something that the people wanted to see. And the people wanted to see it, and the people weren't just black. Yeah, you had a lot of white fans who were going to Negro League games.
You're listening to The Metro on 101.9 WDET. I'm Kerry Jr. II. My guest is Bob Kendrick. He's the president of the Negro Baseball Museum in Kansas City, Missouri. We are discussing how the Negro League came to be through the tactics of its founder, Rube Foster. So, Bob, you were talking about the style in which Negro League teams played and how that style was celebrated, was appreciated by black audiences, white audiences, and that drew people, all kinds of people, to the game. What type of impact did that have on the game's trajectory?
So Rube organized these leagues, and it started with 8 independent black baseball teams coming together. One of them, which was the great Kansas City Monarchs. And the Monarchs owner was a guy named J.L. Wilkinson. He was the only white owner of the original 8 Negro League franchises. And initially, Rube did not want any white ownership. He really didn't. But he kept hearing these things about this dude named J.L. Wilkinson. And Buck O'Neill, who played for Wilkie here for the Monarchs, would say of J.L. Wilkinson that he was the first white man that he ever met who had no prejudice. So Wilkie didn't have a prejudice bone in his body. When there weren't enough hotel rooms to go around, they slept in the same bed together. Yeah, he bought the finest uniforms that money could buy for his Monarchs, the finest buses that money could buy. And his players absolutely adored him because he treated them with great respect, great dignity. And he built one of the greatest baseball franchises, not in black baseball history, but in baseball history. Kansas City Monarchs, man, had one losing season in their almost 40-year existence in the Negro Leagues. And that was during World War II, when so many of their stars had been called into service. As a matter of fact, had it not been for World War II, we likely don't get Jackie Robinson, because Jackie comes here to play for the Kansas City Monarchs in 1945. If the Monarchs have their full contingent of players, so many of them have been called into service. If they have their full roster intact, Jackie never gets invited to try out, and how would history have been altered? But Rube would ultimately relent and allow Wilkie in to bring his charter Kansas City Monarchs into the fold because Wilkie had what Rube needed, and that was access to stadiums. He knew in order for his league to survive, he needed that access to stadiums. Because I tell my guests here at the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum all the time, really the only thing that separated the Negro Leagues from the major leagues was financing. Yeah, the major leagues had more money. They had their own ballparks. Now, you had a few Negro League teams that ultimately had their own stadiums. But by and large, they were renting those ballparks from those major league teams, which is also why it took so long to integrate, because they're making money from the Negro Leagues. Yeah, they were renting the ballpark, man. They're getting a percentage of the gate and likely all of the concessions. So there were some teams that were in no hurry to see integration because they were afraid they lose this source of revenue. And so Wilkinson does indeed bring in the Monarchs. Rube is able to set the course for his newly formed Negro National League. He would stand there at the Paseo YMCA and he boldly proclaimed, "We are the ship, all else the sea."
The league motto.
That was the Negro League's, I guess you could say, declaration of independence. He was sending a resounding message to Major League Baseball that a new player had arrived on the scene to be reckoned with. And honestly, Rube's vision, and this will give you an indication of just how visionary he was. He thought that he could create a league that was so dynamic that it would force Major League Baseball's hand to expand. So if you can picture this, they would say, let's say they would take 4 teams out of the Negro National League and then disperse the best players from the other 4 teams to those 4 teams that are now merging with Major League Baseball. And under Foster's vision, you would have had complete integration in the 1920s. And think about this. This is the exact same thing that we saw eventually with the merger of the old AFL with the National Football League. And for those of us who are basketball fans, the merger of the ABA with the NBA. See, the NBA was watching the ABA bring in all these black stars. They were doing things to the game, the three-point line, the slam dunk contest, the red, white, and blue basketball. And these fans started flocking to these ABA games. And the NBA said, wait a minute, we better do something. And they eventually merged those teams. And so when people look at the San Antonio Spurs, the Denver Nuggets, now they're the Brooklyn Nets. They were the New Jersey Nets at one point in time. These teams were all part of the old ABA. Now, that was Rube Foster's vision years, decades before we saw that. That's how visionary he was. One of the treasured pieces that we have here at the museum is his financial journal. We have his financial journal that documents every business transaction that took place in the Negro Leagues between 1920 through 1925 until he got sick and he could no longer serve in his role as president of the Negro Leagues. And this is important because it dispels the notion that the Negro Leagues were some kind of unorganized, fly-by-the-seat-of-your-pants operations. Every business transaction meticulously detailed in this ledger.
Was that an assumption of the league that it was not this organized machine?
It's the assumption of the baseball community. Because, they looked at the Negro Leagues as being inferior, as being unorganized. And so pieces like this kind of helps alter, to some degree, that kind of false perspective that folks had about these leagues. It was a tremendously organized league. And as I mentioned, every financial detail meticulously documented in this ledger.
What does that really look like? I want to kind of get an illustration of what he did that could have rubbed people the wrong way.
He controlled the books. He controlled the umpires. He made all the decisions. No. So that rubbed people the wrong way. Plus, he has his own team. So he's competing, and some felt like he might set up the rules to favor him in some of these instances.
What else did Foster do? What else did he do that may have rubbed people the wrong way or gotten people on his bad side.
Rube ran the Negro Leagues like a tyrant. He really did. He controlled every aspect of black baseball operations. Rube Foster was getting 5% of the annual gate. Now, I can tell you right now, no other owner in any sport had a deal quite like that, because when Rube started the Negro Leagues, he had either booking rights or ownership of 4 of the original 8 teams. So essentially, he divested ownership of 3. He kept the Chicago American Giants, and then in a deal with the Negro Leagues, was paid 5% of the gate. Well, in 1920 alone, over 400,000 fans attended Negro League games. And as I oftentimes say, I ain't that great at math, but if you're getting 5% of that 400,000 that went through the turnstiles, yeah, you're doing pretty doggone good. Even though the Negro Leagues were having unprecedented success, as you could well imagine, man, there was some within his ranks that thought Rube had too much power. Yeah, no, the story has it that Rube was on league business in Indianapolis in 1925. He's asleep in his hotel room when he's exposed to a gas leak. Now, a passerby smells the gas, kicks in, rescues him. He's unconscious. Well, when he comes to, he was never the same. Likely suffered brain damage while he was in that unconscious state, and it caused him to have fits of violent outrage, which ultimately forced his family to have to institutionalize him, where a few years later, he dies of a heart attack. Well, when Rube died, the fans of Chicago, who absolutely adored him, man, they lined the streets for 3 consecutive days to pay their respect to their beloved Rube Foster. But as I mentioned, Rube, there was no middle ground. You either loved him or you hated him. And he had a laundry list of those who really didn't care for him. And there's great belief that that gas leak wasn't accidental, that someone tried to take old Rube out. The most brilliant mind in baseball history dies in an insane asylum. No, you can't make this stuff up, man. It is too good. There's got to be a TV series done on the Negro Leagues. And as I always tell my guests, I sure hope they make old Bob the executive producer.
Right.
Bob Kendrick is the president of the Negro Baseball Museum in Kansas City, Missouri. He will be speaking tonight at 5:30 at the Charles H. Wright Museum of African American History as part of the William G. Anderson Lecture Series out of Michigan State University. Coming up, a young Detroit artist illustrates Black life through the lens of rest. Stay right there. We'll be right back on The Metro.